This program is brought to you by Newsworks in cooperation with the City of Eau Claire. This program is simulcast on WRFP-LP 101.9 FM.
All right, let me go ahead and get started. I think most people who are going to be here are here. There are some snacks up here behind that you are certainly welcome to help yourself to. In about 6:30, a little before 6:30, we'll have a little more food coming in. It is our hope tonight that we can hold the time and the time commitment in terms of expectation for people. About an hour and a half. We have two topics to work on tonight. One is the strategic plan and the work plans, and we're hopeful that that'll take about half an hour, and then kicking off and starting the CIP process would be about an hour. So help yourself to the snacks. Again, there'll be a little more food. Since it's starting right at 5:30 for this, it'll be really easy to track us in terms of the half hour and the hour. So quickly, just some background on the strategic planning, a little bit about the history of where we've been and what we've done, particularly since there's a lot of work that's been done on the strategic planning process. But we have some new council members, and so I'm going to take just a moment and do a touch point on where we've been at and what we're doing with that. Our first strategic planning process goes back to about 10 years ago. In 2008, we've operated a very traditional strategic planning model. It went on about a 3-year cycle, and so you can see that we had one in 2008, one in 2011, one in 2015. They were very traditional strategic planning in the sense that you kind of did a SWOT, which you might be familiar with, a strength, weaknesses, opportunity, threats exercise. You spent some time on the mission and the vision, and you would develop key action areas, and then there would be 3 years of work or ideas, fairly big projects that would be identified, big issues. And in those strategic plans, there was usually about 60 items that would be spread over about a 3-year period. One of our reactions or thoughts to that was that that traditional process was not very nimble. It was not very responsive. You would find that years 1 and 2 would be packed in really nice and have lots of good things going on, but by the time you got to year 3, those things were fairly out there. They might be stale, they might not be relevant anymore, they could use a lot of revision. And so in 2018, we started having a conversation about how can we have a strategic planning process that's more nimble, that's more responsive, that is more values-based. So 2018, we spent some time talking about the values of the community, the values of the city council, the values of staff, and tried to direct our planning process to be more values-based and then develop work off of those values. So that work was done in 2018. In 2019, we revised some of the strategic goals and started having some initial work plan discussions, as well as there was a little bit of tweaking on the values. I think I just talked a little bit about this. I mean, why what was the traditional process? It was typically looking a little more backwards than forwards. It was not very nimble. And we were looking to have something that was more values-based, nimble, and that basically the work that we were doing as a council and staff was grounded in those values. So in terms of the strategic plan and the strategic planning process, and again for the new council members, there was a few proposed changes to the strategic values. You can see that we added one in the early part of 2019, and that was one around equity. And it says that we believe in equity. We must create conditions for all people to thrive and proactively address disparities in health, social, and economic prosperity. So that is proposed. It was part of a conversation and work that was done with a consultant by the name of Julia Novak. It hasn't been approved yet, and so this part of what we're talking about is how this comes together and then what we want to bring back for approval. But at this point, that is the strategic value that was been added to previous work that was done and will be coming forward for review. Then there was 7 strategic goals, and just a little bit of a quick review again for the new council members on some of the tweaks to that. Our first one is related to economic development, and you can see we expanded that a little bit, or are proposing to expand that from fostering a diverse and creative economic development to supporting economic prosperity for all with diverse, creative economic development and inclusive housing options. So that's the proposed change for the I'll call it the economic development strategic goal. The second one has to do with really our environment and our infrastructure. And you can see that it was to provide safe, functional, and we're adding accessible infrastructure and services. So that goal is being broadened out to be more than just infrastructure, to include the services that we provide, and emphasizing that they're environmentally sustainable and sensitive. The third one then is does not have any proposed changes to it, and that is that we would optimize the city's organizational potential. So the third one is geared towards the organization itself, and having the organization be strategically evaluated and reviewed so that we make sure we're operating at our most and highest potential as an organization. The fourth one was related to neighborhoods. And we heard a lot about that and the importance of neighborhoods, and I would just emphasize that as a city council and staff, we recognize the really high value of neighborhoods and connecting neighborhoods and having strong and vital and healthy neighborhoods. So we have a whole strategic goal related to neighborhoods. And this one, there was some changes or tweaking to it that we develop, nurture, and revitalize. So we're adding the term revitalize, safe, healthy, and connected neighborhoods. So it's a rewording of the revitalization and redevelopment aspect of neighborhoods. Then the fifth one has to do with community engagement. And here what we're doing is just simplifying it. When this work was done in 2018, the official work had facilitate and engage community, and then there was kind of an example to it, and we're taking the example out of it, and the strategic goal is simply to facilitate and engage community. The sixth one then has creating opportunities to make Eau Claire livable, lovable, and fun. So the fun and livable and lovable, for those of you that are familiar with some of the reading and emphasis that staff has had for some time, and this is really kind of a quality of life on those types of issues. And so, again, not a substantial change, but you can see that the way it was worded before had it really as a question mark. It wasn't a solid statement, and so we're, I guess, wordsmithing that to have it be a solid statement about creating opportunities for the people in Eau Claire to have a place that's livable, lovable, and fun. And then finally, and actually this seventh strategic goal was added last year from some work that was done a little bit before that, and that has to do with learning and growth and development. And so again, in the way it had been presented a year ago, there was more of an example. We're just dropping the example and letting the statement stand on its own to say that we nurture community-wide opportunities for personal learning, growth, and development. So those are the seven strategic goals as they stood before and as they're being proposed for amendments or changes, again, that would be brought back to you at a future date. You can see that we worked with Ms. Novak to have a kind of a document that would outline those and be a little artistic and how we would present those and look at them. So kind of a precursor to what would be coming to you at a future agenda item for approval. So before we move on to the work plan piece of it, I guess maybe just a quick stop here to see if anybody has any questions or comments or feedback on at least the strategic plan and the values component to that, and that we'd be bringing that back to you for approval at a future council meeting. Okay then.
Good.
Yes.
I guess one thing that I'll say is that when we sat down in March, I believe it was, and we wordsmithed all of these goals, the strategic goals, I mean, we obviously made a lot of changes in some cases. So like certainly if any of the new members on council like feel like there's some tweaking, like this is the time to propose that, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, this is the conversation. We try, these are strategic goals, and you would hope that they stay relatively stable, because they guide us over, multiple years, and that we don't, pivot on them too much. And again, as you're pointing out, there was some refinement or tweaking to them. Primarily expansions. I don't think there was much in the way of contractions on them, but just expanding to clarify the council's intent on those strategic goals. But yeah, if there was something that you're looking for to change, this would be the time, because unless there's other feedback, we'll be bringing back the document that you have in front of you here.
I would just have
Yeah.
a statement, nothing to change.
Sure.
When we had the proclamation on recognizing the 19th Amendment, there was Altoona had already done that proclamation, and they had some language in there about being committed to equity or something like that. So when we were preparing it for City of Eau Claire, I asked Dale to please use the draft language to make it consistent with what the draft is. So if you're working on documents, you might consider coming back to this language to help make consistent with what we're working towards.
Yep, good, that's a really good point. Okay. And if there's no other comments or feedback on that, let's move forward then to how we develop the work that we want to do around those 7 strategic goals, and how we want to manage that work from a staff perspective and from a council perspective. So a couple of things. As part of also that work that was done in March, we took and looked at things that staff had ideas, or things that were already in progress related to doing work around those strategic goals. And council also did some work on that, and I just want to talk a little bit about that and maybe how we want to use that going forward. To put it in context a little bit, the items that we worked on in March and I guess the tasks or projects that were brought forward are in addition to, I think it's really important to keep in context that the items that end up on the strategic plan or work plans or whatever we end up calling them, they are in addition to other work that's already ongoing within the organization. And so part of that is the CIP project, so we're going to be talking about the CIP project. So keep in mind that when we talk about these projects or things we want to include that move us forward strategically, it's already on top of or in addition to the CIP projects that we do. At least currently, it's also in addition to the work that we're doing to renovate and move back into City Hall. It's in addition to the challenges that we face as an organization with the fairly significant turnover that's happening as the baby boomers leave. It's also in addition to the residents' responses, or just the things that come in from citizens that ask us to respond to different things. And then just that routine work that all the departments do to keep the organization and the community running and going forward, and the advisory committee work plans. So each of the advisory committees also have work plans that are out there that have demands on staff time. So just a little bit of context in terms of how that how the work that we're talking about doing, which was outlined in the report. I hope you all got that. It was the work, it's entitled March 2019. It was the goal-setting retreat, that's the work that we did with Ms. Novak. So all of those ideas and tasks that were in there are in addition to all of these kinds of things. And part of the conversation that we're having in terms of how we manage the work that is of interest and wants to be done is in the context of, I guess, last year was a really, really ambitious year. And there was about 20 projects that were brought forward that really were not anticipated. They were not part of a strategic planning process, and they ended up bumping out some other work and weren't necessarily in the context of work that it was ongoing or anticipated. And that's not bad. Because anything we do is important, but I think it's also important that we put it in the context of priorities, because we just don't have the resources to do everything. And so a lot of this conversation is about making sure that what staff is doing is, and what council is doing, is aligned with the priorities that we've all agreed are important and moving us forward. So when we look at what took place at the work session with Ms. Novak, there was about 45 existing initiatives that from a staff perspective we brought forward. There was about 73 proposed future initiatives. Of the 73, 15, as they were rated by the council, had other or lower priority. So that left about 103 existing top or high priorities. And this did not include the 28 items that Mr. Allen had brought forward for affordable housing. So affordable housing was just one item of the 103, but staff had already identified about 28 things that we thought we might want to be moving forward with related to affordable housing. And then that did not also include the library or the health department. So there was a few things in there, but the library and health department as separate organizations have their own work plans and things that they're doing. So, from a staff perspective, so we did all that work, right? There was a lot of good work, a lot of good ideas that were put up there. And since that time, I've heard some feedback from both staff members and then also council members. Well, what about this, and what about that? And we forgot this, and we forgot that, and at least on the staff perspective, we had some very small examples like the census, right? We got an upcoming census, and there's a lot of work we want to do around the census. That wasn't even up on that list at all. The elections work, there's some work that we're doing around elections and trying to expand opportunities for elections, and that wasn't up on the list. And you received a letter from the Health East Communities group on alcohol policy, and that was something that when we have internal planning, I can show you that we have a document that well over a year ago was addressing alcohol policy in the community. And last summer, actually the public intoxication ordinance really, and the work that went into that, just bumped that totally off of our ability to work on that last summer. So, public policy related to alcohol and excessive alcohol in the community was something that, from a staff perspective, we had wanted to work on. And again, that didn't come forward in the planning process in March, but was one of those things that we had already been talking about in the past. So, there's over 130 projects there, and there's a realization, at least from our perspective, from a staff perspective, that this list is really not complete. And then you also have is it realistic to put 130 items in 12 to 24 months on top of all the other work that staff does, especially when you consider that most of the work is done by a relatively small handful of folks. And so we were at a point where, just like the strategic plan, I think is kind of buttoned up and ready to go, and being brought forward. And we were at a point where we as from a staff perspective went through and we took all 130 items and we essentially scheduled them out as to when we could work on them in the next 12 to 24 months. And it was time to bring that back to council and say, okay, council, do you want to lock in on this? Right? Do you want to lock in? And this is what we're going to say we're going to do for the next 12 to 24 months. But I was getting some feedback that, well, how will we change that? What happens if something comes in 2 months from now that's a little bit different? How do we want to react to that? And so I wanted to have an opportunity to have just a conversation with you about, how do we want to manage this and how do we want to communicate it? So it's an excellent work. There's a great list. It really is, I would like to point out, it's our first time really trying to track and prioritize work and be able to share that with the council in terms of what we're doing and what we're thinking about. So I'm really happy about the work and what we're trying to do here. But I just wanted to make sure we have an opportunity to talk about, do we really want to be locking ourselves into so much detail and so much, is this really an effective way to move forward strategically? And frankly, the goal of this was to be more nimble. So, is it going to be counterproductive and we become less nimble if we become so rigid that from a council perspective we say, nope, it wasn't on the work plan, you can't bring anything forward? Or if staff is bringing something forward, even though Ms. Novak's report was very clear in saying that not every staff member or department is fully engaged in this work, and so if they have the capacity to do something else, should they be prohibited from doing something else? And there's also efficiency issues that we're always trying to look at, and so are those prohibited from bringing forward? So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, and perhaps in terms of I'll offer up an example of something that might be a model for how we want to look at this going forward. And that is the sustainability conversation. So in 2018, the City Council passed a goal, basically, and I call it a sub-goal really, of the strategic plan, that they wanted to have us move towards having 100% renewable energy and carbon neutrality by 2050. There wasn't a single work plan issue attached to that. But yet in about, I guess, how many months would that be? So that's like 15 months. There's been 30 things. And I'm not going to go through them all here, but there's 30 things related to that goal that staff and or council has brought forward. And if we were to go back to March of 18 and say, well, what are the 30 things we want to do in the next 12 months related to that sustainability goal, I guarantee you we would not have thought of these 30 things. And we would not have identified these 30 things. But because that was a goal and staff knew that was a priority and council knew it was a priority, there were some ideas and things coming forward from council that fit nicely. There were staff things that were being driven that fit nicely. There were work plans that were being updated, say with the sustainability committee. And so you've got these 30 things related to data and planning, and then also the partnerships and networking that took place. And so if you look back, you go, wow, that's really cool. Now, part of the challenge is we haven't from staff perspective, we haven't communicated that very well. So I don't know that as a council you go, wow, did you know that we had done 30 things in the last year related to moving it towards that goal? Some of you have some sense of some of them, but probably not all of them. So I don't know that I know exactly what the solution to this is, but what I'm wondering is if we want to, or if there's some appetite for trying to have some, I'll call them sub-goals, so that of the 7 strategic goals, we develop some sub-goals that look a lot like the sustainability, and then there's work that is developed around those, and we set up a formal process for communicating what that work is. And we got, the start is here with these 130 things, and it's already, much scheduled out. But do we have a mechanism that communicates with council and with staff that keeps everybody moving forward, that says, hey, here are the things we're working on, and here's how it ties out. But it changes when council brings something forward or when staff brings something forward. We would just update it and put it in. If we lock into 130 things, my concern is that anytime there's a change, either from a staff perspective or the council perspective, we'll have to go back and say, well, how does that reorder everything for staff? And then we go back, we reorder it, bring back, and then you have to reapprove the 130 things. So I'm wondering if there's some middle ground there, again, I don't know exactly what that looks like, that keeps us being nimble, but also accountable and moving forward, and reporting out, and so we can show what that progress is. A couple of ways I've thought about this is, it's if we adopt this, I'm a sailor, right? And so, if you look at a compass rose, there's 360 degrees, and if we say that, if we want to lock this in, we're essentially saying, well, we're going to go 30 degrees, northeast, and there's no movement off that unless there's a vote that says we're moving off of that. Or do we say, you know what, we want to be going northeast, somewhere between 0 and 90 degrees, and anything within that 0 to 90 degrees is fair game, right, because we're moving in that direction. But you know what, going 240 degrees is not fair game, because that's going the opposite direction where we wanted to go, or 180 degrees south. And so is there a way of defining a little broader range that keeps us moving forward in that direction, but doesn't tie staff or council down so tightly that we actually become counterproductive or less nimble? Because the whole goal of this, at least from my perspective, is that we could be more nimble within the values-based work that we've done. I'm going to stop right there and get your reaction to kind of where we're at, and where you might want to be going forward. So, yes, Jill.
I appreciate the conversation. I thought that this process that we worked on for the work plan and strategic plan was very productive, and it was very inclusive, and it started a conversation, but it only started a conversation. And I think that's what you're pointing to is, whoa, now we've got.
Now what?
Yeah, we've got this thing, and we didn't know that it was gonna go this direction. So the other piece that is, you have staff that are working on this more than 40 hours a week, and your concentration is on your work plan and productivity, and I'm not working that kind of mental or physical time on strategic plans, so you've got a gap of creativity and productivity, and there'll be an alignment issue there. So the only thing that changes that, I think, is the quality of communication and the understanding of what is it a 90 degree or is it a 45 degree? So I think, I'm definitely a 90 degree kind of person. I'm almost kind of a 180 degree kind of person. If you trust that we're all pulling in the same direction, and that with different councils, you'll have different issues, different process. If you have changes in staff, you'll have different issues, different process. But I think what we're doing here is going to influence how well that transition is going to go. And I would really like to see not lock in, that I'm not a lock-in sort of person. I'd like to say that, for instance, working with conversations we've started down in Shawtown, they've got some concerns that they've been talking about over a period of time. And if I were to discover that, oh, that's right next door to something that engineering is working on, I would like to believe that somehow my conversation could enter in ahead of whatever was locked in. I would like to understand that, oh, if this is something that's already on the docket for next year, I could slide in next to that. That's kind of my understanding of how the world works before I was introduced to government. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Other thoughts, reaction? Andrew?
Just to get a clarification, when you're saying 130, is that taking all of the points, even the ones that we voted one on?
There's only the high priority and the, 130 items is the, what was it?
So it's table 2 in the document. Page 9 is where that list starts, like halfway down, essentially.
But
So,
that includes the staff and
yeah,
staff.
so it was the high and, it wasn't the low priority issues. So as you look at the report, if you look at Julia's report, it was only the items that received, when she put it through there, so they're called top and high. So the top and high priorities, the other priorities are not in there.
And I think out of that 130 that you're referencing, I think council is, introduced 36 of that 130.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, because we put a whole lot of things on the board, but I think we narrowed down to 33 or 36, something like that.
Yeah, 'cause that's how many of those stickers we had.
Right. So
So
just to
that's-
be clear, it's not that council's asking for 130.
Oh, no, no, no,
something.
not at all. No,
Okay.
because this included all of the base work that the city had already, I mean, the staff had already brought forward. So, yeah, I want to be really clear. This is not 130 things that the council's asking, the
Yeah.
staff to do. This is if you look at things that were already in the works or things that staff thought that we should move forward on that, that council supported and thought was a good idea. In addition to some new ideas from council, if you add all that up, you get to the 130, so.
Yeah.
It's a combination of, I'm not, if I said that or tried to imply that, no, it's not 130 items from council.
And going off of that, I think one of the concerns, Dale, was that there was this sense that if council members brought forward an idea, a policy idea, that staff said, well, we're too booked, we can't actually take that on, and council ideas were seen as in addition to things that were already happening. And to me, that's, as an elected leader, that's not, that wasn't workable. There was a number of times where it was, well, we've got our plates full, we can't take on this thing. And I think that's why it's helpful that we're coming back to say, what's actually doable from your office, from the city staff. But that also allows council members, if we ran on an issue, participatory budgeting or something, we ran on an issue and got elected on an issue, we want to be able to push it forward. And that's coming with community backing. And so I think that's where I want to make sure that we're keeping that lens of how we got to this work plan in the first place. So, yeah.
So I would, just some feedback on that. So staff shares that very same concern. I mean, they have the same concern that if we lock in too tightly, well, what if there's something that staff goes, wow, that, we need to address this. Or we forget, like the census, right? We can't just ignore the census. And if that wasn't on a work plan because people weren't thinking far enough ahead and all of a sudden it's here, we don't want to be locked in and go, well, how do we ignore the census? That's a very real one. My hope would be that we can come up with a process that lets this really put things in context so that if there is something new, the work that's being done, I think, Jill, you point, it's the communication. It's how do we communicate what we're doing, and if we do, and if there is a council initiative or directive, hopefully it is within the context of these values and the fact that we've had the conversation and there's it's being positioned because it fits within the values, and the council can have that conversation amongst yourselves. But also to the extent then that's what we want to do, we can talk about what does that mean, right? I mean, what does that shift? What does that when will we be able to get to that? And we can put it in the context of all of the work. Not so much that we can't do it, but put it in the context of, with the resources we have available, what does it mean if that has become a higher priority? What does that mean in terms of what we can do? So I agree, and that's why I wanted to have that conversation, is it becoming too locked in? Is it too much of an overreaction? Last year with the 20 things was really overwhelming. From a staff perspective, and it wasn't a conversation in context. But we don't want to overreact to that so much that we lock down and we lose our flexibility and nimbleness, from a council perspective or a staff perspective. So I'm trying to find some middle ground there. Yes, Kathy?
Oh, Lori, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, I think actually David was first before.
You're right. Sorry, David.
I wasn't involved in this. So if I say something that is inaccurate, just slap me. There are some very ambitious additions to that strategic goals and objectives. And I'm not saying anything about them not being important or anything else. I mean, they're all very important and they're worthwhile. Very worthy. But in terms of the challenge of what list you want to get done, is that somewhat stemming from the breadth of all these strategic goals and objectives? And again, that's not a bad thing, okay? But it would seem to me that for a given calendar timeframe, say 1 year, whatever, okay, you've got 360 degrees if you're, of all the things that all departments have to get done from January through December. Okay. And if you're looking at that compass rose between 315 and 45 degrees, okay, what of these components are we gonna put in there that keep us going somewhat north? And when something comes up that's important, that wasn't anticipated, does it fit in there? Or doesn't?
Well, and the hope would be that that's a conversation that the council and the staff has to just affirm that it does fit, and at least be able to, when we're talking about new work, again, either from the council or staff, that it is put in the context of all the other work that's there. And that's really what was missing last summer, is these new ideas, new projects or new tasks, but it wasn't in the context of, well, where does that rate, compared to other things, and what's the impact of that?
Cool. So I'm gonna get a little technical on project management techniques. Are you guys familiar with like agile methodology or
What's that?
agile methodology?
No.
Or any other sort of out there project management techniques in marketing or software developments?
Not in software, I'm not in software development, but Bob would be.
Let's get nerdy.
Okay.
So the way that we've done it is sort of a modified agile approach. Agile approach is the idea that pieces of a project get delegated out to different stakeholders. Those stakeholders have a regular stand-up once a week that says, what's my progress and what's in my way? And that way, there's someone that's a scrum leader or project manager that's able to say, okay, let me remove these barriers for you so you can keep moving forward. The way that we do it in my company is kind of similar to that, only a little bit more expanded. And we kind of have, because we have like 10 different clients, and they each have their own like 10 or 15 tasks every month that we're trying to get done. We only have a staff of 7 people plus some outsourcers. So we've got a lot of moving pieces to handle. And so we kind of look at it as, we've got 2 weekly meetings, so we have sort of 4 tiers of things that are happening. We've got our active and engaged stuff, and that's the thing that has a very specific deadline, and it's something that needs to get done. And between our client and our team, it's been decided that that is the most important, critical thing to do. And there's a second tier, which is it's queued up, it's on the radar, or it's paused and on hold, but we know it's going to be coming back up as active very quickly. Third tier down is more of like a back burner thing. We know it's going to come up in the future, but it's not something that's the highest priority right now. And there's sort of like a slush file or an archive of things that are like way future stuff, and we know it's going to come back at some point, but it's probably not in the next quarter, so we're not worrying about it right now. And so it sounds like it's more of just developing this system of saying, okay, well, who's the project manager in this situation? Who's delegating the projects? Who's tracking the availability of all the different departments that have interest in these different pieces of the project? And then coming up with a system to basically say, okay, step 1 is we rank priorities to say, like, here's what council or whatever the interested parties say is the weighted value of these things relative to everything else. Step 2 is we compare that to what's available in departments to say, okay, well, if we've got, more openings in this department versus this department, maybe even though this one's weighted higher, we can't do this one right now, we have to slot this other one in instead and get that done first, and then this next one will come back up. It's scheduled in, and then there's some sort of checkpoint to say this is where we're going to be checking in on the progress of those things. And then at the end of a determined period, there's a reevaluation, and we can go back and say, okay, well, what, are these weights still valid? Do we need to re-weight anything? And if there's another like voting process or something like that to help set that priority, that's what would cycle back through that system. I think I got all my points here. But that's generally speaking how we're able to manage projects when you've got limited resources and still get a lot of things done very quickly.
So I agree with all that as it relates to managing the project. And I think much of that can apply to that next layer up, which is, do you do the project at all? And so much of what we're talking about here is, do you even take on the project?
Sure.
Versus how you would manage the project once it's been decided.
So what we've said now already is that there's 130 items, and out of those 33 or 36 we carved out to say like these are priority ones. And so we've already kind of said like, here's our complete back burner stuff, now here's our stuff that's kind of queued up, now how do we take that and start to slice stuff out of that? And
Right.
I think that there's probably just a weighted vote system that needs to happen in order to say like, here's what we think is the most important for maybe a set period of time, whether it's a quarter or 6 months or 2 months or whatever that is. Maybe we can figure that out as a group, but that's, I guess, based on my experience with project management, how stuff's gonna get done.
Right, right. So so absolutely and that's really the question, is some methodology to how we adapt or change or add that has staff and the council feeling like there's enough flexibility to, like if you ran on something and you really it's important, how do you get that into the mix? And then just the reality from a staff perspective that, yeah, we have the resources to be able to get it all done. So.
Well, I think that's the bridge that we're crossing right
Right.
now, which is saying like,
It is.
well, council, if you're saying, hey, council set priorities here, cool, we can probably figure out a way to weight these things for you to say, like, here's the stuff that we think is number 1 to number 36 ranked. What can we do to help start to filter this stuff out?
And that, I think that works good with, or can work with the existing list of projects, but one of the other questions was, things are gonna come up throughout the course of
Sure.
time, so how are we then able to either
Right.
add or move?
Yep.
And what's the process for doing that? Does that require us coming back to, does that become an agenda item on a council meeting, is to go through and reprioritize, when projects are added, or what does that look like?
I think it's just setting a realistic time benchmark to say, let's check in on everything at every 2 months, or every 3 months, or whatever that is, to say like, okay, where's progress on these actionable items? These are done, these are still in progress. Here are the newest priorities that came introduced in this period of time, and, maybe we can't act on these things tomorrow, but they get filtered into that list, they get moved into that delegated list, the back burner list, like anything else, or up into the actual queue or
Yep.
active items list.
I agree, and that goes back, Jill, to your comment about communicating the work.
Yeah.
Basically, as as long as things are being brought forward, and they're brought forward in that context of the priorities and, staying within, quadrants, then it's how do we, from a staff perspective, report back and say, here's where we're at, and here's how it's going, and this thing was able to move forward faster than we thought, and this thing got moved out a little bit, and it keeps everybody at least appraised of where things are at and how it's fitting together. That has to be part of this going forward.
Yeah, and I think to your point too, there's a little bit of a pre-planning that needs to happen too on the city's side to be able to say like, here are the resources that these things would even require
Right.
from our different departments. And so,
Which goes into the conversation about, well, if we do want to take something forward, and that helps council put into context, well, if we really want to do this, is this a little thing and it can happen relatively quickly, or, wow, this thing's gonna bump out all kinds of stuff, and is that really what we want to do?
yeah, fair. I don't need to dominate the conversation, you just really hit on my wheelhouse here. So.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to have the conversation. Okay. Other thoughts? Catherine?
Yeah, so I'm gonna be referencing the strategic plan and the work plan draft that was sent out to council on a May 24th email, in case you wanna look at it. It's a city manager update on May 24th, page 11 to be precise. And I don't know, do you have a copy of the work plan that you could show on the screen?
Of, what Ms. Novak put together for us?
Otherwise, I can just reference it. I think one of the questions that I'm hearing is, okay, how do we reconcile, so council adopts a work plan, how do we reconcile the differences? I think we have, I don't know, a good sailing analogy, a Northern Star. I think we already have a built-in Northern Star that I would add a little bit to. So this would be on page 11, of the work plan. And underneath, there's a table that starts off, and then there's a big, kind of medium-sized paragraph. It starts with the sentence, "The city manager."
Mhm.
Okay. So I think that whole paragraph is our northern star of how do we navigate here. And I would have some recommended language that we could ever so slightly modify and add. So, if it's okay, I can just read that. It says, "The city manager will work with staff to integrate the new priorities into the organizational work plan for the next 2 years." So I don't have any suggestions there to change. And then it says, "If there are insufficient resources, staff, budget, et cetera, to address an item within the next 2 years, the city manager will identify how it could be accomplished." I do not have any suggestions there. I think that stands alone. However, I will point back that sentence, "if there are insufficient resources, that the city manager will identify." I'm gonna circle back to that because I think that's what helps us get out of our pickle and allows it to be led by administration via the city manager. So where I would change very slightly would be the next sentence. It says, "Also, if an initiative was not identified as a council priority, but the individual department has sufficient resources to accomplish the item without impacting progress on other council priorities, they will do that." The one word change I'd have there is instead of "but," I would change that to "and." So, "and if an initiative is not identified as a priority and the individual department has sufficient resources, then they'll do that." And then that basically ends that paragraph. So it kind of talks about if staff has something new, they would have that authority. Where I think it's silent is what happens if council brings something.
Exactly.
So I got a sentence that I would recommend us think about. So it's very similar to the staff, except for it's pivoted. "If an initiative was not identified as a council priority, an individual council member or council members may seek council support to pursue the initiatives, such as an ordinance or resolution, by following city codes as found in section 2.08, etc. If the city manager feels the initiative will impact the timeline of staff being able to achieve other council priorities, the manager should follow the process as outlined," and I'm calling it "if there are insufficient resources." So I kind of put a circle back to, then that's what the city manager would follow, is now if council adopts something new, and the manager says, okay, now there's insufficient resources to do other things, they will, then the manager will identify how it could be accomplished in a different way, which could mean it's delayed, other items are delayed, other items can't be done, and that's really where it falls back on the city manager as a partner to say, okay, you all adopted this, and here's how we have to shuffle administratively.
How would we do that in real time? Jeremy and I want to bring up the ordinance to have drinking stations at every bar to help with some of our water drinking stations.
There's already drinking stations.
We want water. We want water accessible.
That's a good thing. Yeah, right. So-
This is an
No,
example.
sober server, it's a
Yeah.
better, it says sober server.
Yeah.
We want sober server. We bring it up. There's even some other council members that want to co-sponsor it maybe multiple. Then how would we go about identifying which things would have to drop back in order to do that?
The manager then does.
How does that, what would that
Right,
look
that's
like?
what we figure out.
That,
So,
And is it a pre-legislative session, you know, like what I did with the public input, or is it right on the agenda? I mean, I think that's what we're figuring out now.
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking that clarifying question
Yeah.
of how does that play out?
I think then, I mean, I guess the manager could have a suggestion, I see some hands here. Ultimately, I think then because the manager is gonna already be prioritizing these 130 things that are coming forth. Ultimately, it's his responsibility to do that. And then in the spirit of the fiscal year, he's going to be prioritizing how these things are gonna get funded within the budgetary constraints, whether it's fiscal year 2020 or fiscal year 2021. If when, not if, when something new comes up outside of the work plan, then administratively, the money's already been budgeted. So it's the city manager's purview to adjust accordingly. And I'm sure that there will be some type of communication, and I think we have to then take our own, I don't know if lumps is the right word, but we gotta take it. We need to be able to take it, to say, we're the ones who wanted to shift the plan, so we gotta accept the consequences of it.
One, to sort of piggyback off those ideas, it could be that the city manager takes a look at the recommendations of what council's put forth and says, okay, well, I've identified that these resources are needed, we've got this, and this project ahead of it, I'm gonna bring that back to council and say, do you wanna bump these things? Or do you want to finish this thing that we've got actively working on, and then this moves ahead in the priority queue, so it's not drop everything and work on this instead. It's, these things are active, let's get this done, now where does this fit into this list? Here's what displaces if you choose to do this. Like, so a report of some kind or something. Doesn't have to be anything extensive, but maybe a recommendation.
So, maybe tying all that together, the way I would see that is, to Andrew, your point on the, how would that work in real time? To me, what it would be, again, it gets back to the reporting mechanism to say, here are the things that we're working on, and, that we report back out, and it's kind of a living, breathing document. And when there is something new that comes in, I can put that information in and say, all right, just so everybody knows, if you want to do this, here's what we think that will do to the work plan. And if you approve it, then the next time you see the work plan, it would, have that in there. So the subtlety of the difference that I'm hearing is that it would become an active part of the conversation. We would put information into the conversation about the impact of the work plan. What wouldn't be there, and from, to your point, Andrew, in terms of mechanics of it, every time there's a change of that, it's not gonna come back to the council to reapprove the work plan, because that, I think, we'd be doing that at every council meeting. Say, well, last time you did this, and I told you the impact, well, here's the revised work plan, and that seems cumbersome to me. So, but the idea that, hey, here is the work plan, and if we're adding something to it, either from a staff or a council perspective, there's a transparent conversation about what that means to the work, as long as everybody understands it, and when we want to add drinking fountains or whatever, or the server, sober server, right? As long as there's a conversation about, well, just know that, Legals has only this much resources, and they get, and that's actually a really good example, because legal changes, they have stuff that happens totally out of their control, right? When dark store, litigation comes, that takes priority. Either that or you don't defend it, and we default in court. So, to the extent that you want to work on sober server, we can say, here's the impact of that. And so when council takes the action on it, they understand the impact, and our obligation is to report that back, and so that there's transparency and knowledge about the impact. What we wouldn't be doing is going back and saying, here is the approved council work plan, and every time there's a subtle change to it, it's got to be another agenda item, that's approving it. So I think that would blend what I'm talking about with what you're talking about too, but I don't know.
And I think with a little bit of a caveat that, at some time interval, there is a check-in on the overall master plan.
Absolutely, on an annual basis. I would say on an annual basis, then we do kind of a little bit of a reset. That's where the nimbleness comes in. Rather than waiting 3 years, on an annual basis, we would spend some time just on that work plan.
I'm not saying even that it needs to be an overall reevaluation of the work plan. I think maybe more of a check-in on the work plan to just say well, here's the things that have changed over the last, again, 3 months, 4 months, something like that. That keeps it a little bit tighter than a year, but doesn't keep it so tight that you feel locked in, or that this is too rigid to get, the space that you need, latitude for some of these other things that do come up and are going to totally annihilate other priorities.
So I definitely see the check-in, what is that? Is it, is it a work session? Is it a report that notes very clearly what's changed, so there's transparency in that?
can I ask what the city's using for project management or task and resource management? Like, is there any software?
No.
Like that?
No, what, we are looking very actively at, it has more to do with citizen complaints and requests for service
Sure.
and managing that. And, you know, because that comes from so many different directions and trying to put that into one place. In fact, we're evaluating something next week on that, so.
Okay. Yeah, it's not quite the same thing.
Yes, no, it's
I
not,
was
it's not
thinking
the
like
same
a project
thing.
management tool,
No.
just like what we use in our studio, where it's like, okay, well, here's our client, here's their main priorities for this month, here's all the
Right.
subtasks that are dependent on those other tasks, here's the deadlines and
Yep.
dates that are on
Yeah,
those.
we have looked at different software packages at times, and finding that balance between the energy it takes to do it versus getting the project done. We've wrestled with some of that, so. All right, well, that was a nice half hour.
Well, I have
Yes.
a few more, but
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wanna let other people share too.
Okay. Others? Yes,
I
Jim?
guess just kind of, there's some immediate, ideas that maybe the three new council members would have that obviously were never had the chance to be included, so I guess maybe that'll test the process of adding new things, 'cause I think we should give that opportunity, but then there are some things that are right on the cusp of getting 4 votes versus 3, like Sunday bus service, for example. And how does that get bumped up or whatever, if possible? And especially when we're talking, I guess the legal, the city attorney's office is an example where things may be difficult to find space and time and may be unpredictable, but so are the things that cost a lot of money versus those that don't. So the Sunday bus service thing is something that would potentially cost a lot of money, operating money. So like, how do we treat those appropriately too in the context of everything? It's maybe another question that's out there, but overall, I like the idea is what we've been talking about in terms of, finding some more structure to this.
Okay, thanks.
And you make a great point, which is that, there are some things that are ending up in the archive that are going to be things that suddenly are priorities again, need to move up in the queue, and there are things that are in the queue that maybe we're towards the bottom that we look at and go, the needs of Eau Claire have changed, and we need to do some other things now instead, so maybe those float into archive and we're gonna keep considering it, but it doesn't need to be a priority anymore. That's where I was kinda getting at the 3 or 4 month kind of check-in process.
Other thoughts? Catherine, you had some more thoughts?
Just from to tag on to what Jeremy shared of, we have 2 brand-new council members and 1 returning council member. I guess I would ask the 3 of you, do you feel comfortable moving forward with the plan that's been shared? Would you feel like you could make some amendments when we vote on it, or do you feel like you need to have some more time to put your potential initiatives in here? Because we did it without you here, which I feel is a little like, a challenge, so out of courtesy to you all, what are you feeling?
If I had been part of the process, I would have probably discussed a few things, but in its entirety, as it's being presented, I don't think I'd have much traction with what changes I would think would be made, so, and I don't have any burning desire to go into a great detail on this. Obviously, the majority of the people that are here approve this thing, so.
No, we also agree with day 2, so I'm not part of the agreement in here. So we probably not much to say, but I think that I'm willing to move forward on this, because you guys all the current city council who have been working through. So I believe for your input and knowledge that experience that we into, so.
Thank you for bringing it up, Catherine. There are actually 2 pieces of either ordinances or ideas that I have that I'm working on behind the scenes that I would absolutely like to bring to the work plan. And there are things that I'm learning being on different committees that are also priorities for the city of Eau Claire. Just sitting on the Visit Eau Claire board has opened my eyes to a couple of things that are happening that I wasn't even aware of, that I think that we should respectfully consider as part of maybe a potential addition to the work plan.
Would you feel comfortable bringing that forth if the next time we saw this was at a legislative session, do you feel comfortable making amendments to add that in there?
I think that would be more difficult.
So then.
Well, I wonder though, I mean, I guess that gets to what do we do with this? And, you know, taking this forward as 130 items and saying, you know, this is the work plan, it's locked in. Or do we have some, I'll call them sub-goals, and we've identified all these things, right? But they're not locked in the sense that the council said this is, I mean, so that, and then it gets back to that reporting mechanism and the touch points to be able to, so that if you know, Laura brings something forward, again, hopefully within the context of it being, you know, within 90 degrees of a direction that the strategic plan wants to go. And there's some feedback or input as to, you know, when you approve that, what the impact is. Then it's more of a reporting process, and the same would happen with staff things. That, and again, I go back to the renewable energy issues. There's lots of things that we can add and report on that will just happen, I guess, almost organically, because the organization's moving on a strategic goal or a sub-goal and so, you know, what I would see is that you'd have sub-goals that you would actually be locking in on, but specific projects and specific tasks are identified and they're there, but, and we all work together in the context of the fact that they are going to be moving, and some will be completed, some get pushed back, some, you know, get revised. But the lock point is not the 130, the lock point is some, it's like, I'll call them sub-goals, that then all this work happens to move us to achieve those sub-goals.
I guess, getting back to your question that you asked me, there's one feeling that I have, and I don't want to leave here and not having said it. My concern is that the strategic goals and objectives have expanded the mission of our city beyond our ability to perform. And my question would be, how are we, is our focus being dispersed like a prism to a point where we're not going to be able to get the important things that we really need to do done, and done well? That would be my only thought, my question.
And respectfully, I think that's what we're kind of talking about, is how do we just figure out of all of these great ideas, how do we pick the top?
I think it has to start at the other end. I think it has to start with a mission and measure the pertinence to these tasks, to this mission.
Weigh it against the mission and the vision of the city, sure.
So that it can earn its name as being strategic goals, basically.
Thank you, Bob.
Dave, I don't know if this is, I'm not sure if this is your point completely, or even partially. When, I'll just paint a little visual, when we were meeting with the facilitator, Ms. Novak, after we revisited the values, strategic operational values and mission statement, and then had these now 7 strategic goals, we then, staff brought the 100-ish items that was on a, I don't know, probably like a giant piece of paper, many pieces of paper. And then council had these tiny little like fortune cookie strips that we taped up under on the wall, under the 8 buckets. So I think the effort was to try to align these desires under the strategic goals and objectives buckets to then try to feed up here.
And you can see that they don't all have the same amount of items underneath them, like 7 and 8, or sorry, 6 and 7, creating engaged opportunities for open living a level of fun and nurturing community-wide opportunities for personal growth and development are very underrepresented compared to the other things. So you could say that, sorry, yeah, 6 and 7 do not have a lot of items. In some ways, we've narrowed almost everything into the top 5. And even among those, there's certain ones that definitely have more, so.
I think sometimes the challenge, or maybe the tension, which is a very normal tension in government between administration and the policymakers, is expectations, you know, I mean, it's a relationship, so it's expectations is that, and when there's those unmet expectations is how can the, working as a team further define that so that we don't have that maybe as much tension and all parties feel like, yep, we're moving forward, we're talking the same language and trying to accomplish the same goals. And so I think that's probably for me, that seems why this is helpful. And ultimately, we have a code that a city code or a city law that we're governed by. And it's hard for electeds, I feel, if a citizen comes to me and says, I have an idea, for me to say, I can't talk to you about it until next year's work plan,
Right.
which I could totally say that. Or, I'm sorry, the council didn't put it on the work plan, therefore it's not important. I could also totally say that. And it seems like, what the heck do you get elected for if you can't work on something?
That's not very nimble.
No, it's not.
It's not very nimble.
So just trying to figure that out is really the intention.
So what, I guess the question is, the next step would have been essentially to bring, I mean, we took the 130 things and we spread them out over 2 years, and I would have brought that forward and said, here's the work plan, and we'll talk next year unless there's an amendment by the council. Would you be open to the idea that I will bring back a process, essentially, that talks about some sub-goals and the work, and it will be these 130 things, but how we can work and manage it. And I mean, you don't have something in front of you to react to. I mean, I'm at a point where I'm just asking you, are we open to something that has a little more flexibility to it and nimbleness to it than just saying, you adopted 130 things and that's all we do until you amend it? And because that's where we were at, and I heard some concerns from staff, I heard some concerns from council, and I'm just wondering if there's an appetite to trying to find something that addresses the issues. I mean, I'll bring something back in writing, a proposal for how we manage our work plan and how we add to it, right? If somebody wants to add to it, and what that looks like for you to consider.
that'd be great.
I mean, are you open to that?
I'm open to it, but the thing that is concerning to me is that, and I brought this up with you and also in our work session, is that when, especially from the elected side, when you run on a sub-goal, it's incredibly difficult. People understand like specific things that are going on. They understand, you know, like we've done this, we have a sustainability goal, we're meeting this goal. Like those are very exact things. And so I guess what I'm saying is it still has to come down to like, if I look at this, it's like, we have citywide Wi-Fi on here. We have Affordable Housing Committee, Advisory Committee.
Yep.
We have, you know, some of these very tangible things that people can understand.
Yep.
As soon as you go too high level, then people have a harder time understanding what those are. And that's where I want to make sure that we're still keeping
But
the focus on the individual items.
But what if,
because-
Andrew, what if you had in front of you the list of the tangible items that staff is working on that are aligned with these sub-goals that
Mhm.
council adopted, but you have that document, so you know, here's where it fits, and here's where it's queued out. And if you wanted to bring something forward that was unique to you, you would get some feedback that says, if you do that, just understand, this is what it's gonna do to the work plan. And then if council votes it up and says, yep, that's what we wanna do, you've done it with an informed, information that, that's moved this out, or it's moved it up, or, what have you. And so, you would be consciously deciding how you're impacting the work or the priorities. It wouldn't prohibit you from doing it. It just puts it in a little more context of the impact that it does to other things that are on the table.
What about in the scenario that council, I've had this experience where I've brought an idea forward and I'm told it's not in the budget, can't do it. And then I want to put something in the budget and you can't do it because it's not in the work plan. So how do we make sure that we move away from being stymied by one another to it can be supported regardless of which door it enters in?
Right. I guess I recognize that mechanism needs to be there, and I guess what I'm asking for is there openness to, staff drafting something that you could take a look at, and it would have to have that mechanism. So again, what I'm trying to avoid is, a whole bunch of stuff that gets approved by the council, but it's not in the context of what's doing for staff, and what our resources are, but yet still allows for council to make that conscious decision that, yeah, we want to do this, but understanding the impact of it.
Will the same thing happen, like my attention was drawn to this opposite side parking, the parking issue,
Mhm.
alternate side parking change? That was initiated by staff.
Right.
Did that, was that,
So
then in that case, would that also bump something?
So
Would we be able to see that it's bumping something?
So from, again, that would have gone back to, say, the language that Catherine referenced earlier, where the street department, there's very little in the strategic plan of the 130 things that the street department, is responsible for. But they're keenly aware of their own efficiency, and to the extent that they are proposing a change that helps their operational efficiency, they would be bringing something like that forward because they're trying to improve their own operational efficiency in the context. So, in that case, it doesn't bump anything out because it's with a department that is, not in the front lines of this, for example.
But if Jeremy comes forward and says, we want to do a permit parking in the third ward ordinance, and they say, well, we've already started on this other thing, we can't handle that at this point, how does that work?
We have to figure out how to work through that, and I guess what I'm saying is there's gotta be a better way than the council adopts 130 tasks, and the only way we do anything is the council amends that 130 tasks. That just seems very inflexible from a staff perspective and a council perspective, and it, so, before bringing that to you, I was just wondering if there's an appetite to trying something that has a little more flexibility for council and staff.
The answer to me is yes.
Yeah, I think the main, are we finished? Dave? Yeah. Or, are you done?
I'm done.
Okay. He says yes. I agree, and I think the main thing is the communication piece. I think above all, if you look at last year and the 20 extra things, I think the challenge is I didn't know, I had said this before, I didn't know what staff was.
There was no context
right.
for council, and I get that, I
Yeah.
totally understand
So-
that. There was no context to say, well, what does this mean if we
Right.
do this?
I don't know what you're working on. So the communication is, so that's important. And then also, actually, I was thinking before Catherine said, but she said, I was thinking kind of the same thing as well as having work, like what if I have an idea and instead of getting a hard stop no, like the conversation is, okay, well, how can we how can we make this work? Sort of conversation. So, and that's what you're saying with the mechanism for it.
The
So-
mechanism, and it puts it in the context, so if there's a decision made, it's put into the context of here's the impact of that decision.
Right.
Which, we should be able to change, and be flexible to say, you know what? Because of this changing condition, this is more important now than that.
Right. And then I think too, with what Andrew was saying, I think it somehow it could go both, but if staff, like the other alternate, going back to the parking thing, as long as we know that, and maybe if council doesn't want, if something else, if we do wanna do a third, or,
Permanent parking.
yeah, permanent parking, if that takes priority over alternative parking, if council wants to do that, then I would think that council could make that choice. So, I've already heard from constituents that they don't want to go back to the other way, so they don't want staff to work on that, yeah. So that-
And yes, that's the conversation we'd have.
Yeah,
mean,
I think so, just having a vehicle to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I'm wondering about the, you know, the transparency of a document like this. Is it something that we have on our website so the public can see what we're working on and comment on, and if they see something that they like or that they don't like, what is the most appropriate way for them to have an impact on that? Because I think that's important too, is, you know, just as the council needs to know, I think the public needs to know, but what's the, what is our plan for that? I guess should be baked into it.
Okay. Yes, Catherine?
If you go this route, or not you, the
If we-
team,
yeah,
the team,
we
right?
go this way.
The team goes this way, how do we then set ourselves up as a team, as an organization for success with the operating budget for 2020? If we're not giving direction on clear programming goals, how do we, cause I'd
So-
like to avoid kind of the challenges that we had last year.
So, we have, I mean, the piece that you don't have yet is I mean, we took the 130 things and spread them out over 8 quarters, basically, and said, you know, this is how, from a staff perspective, we can work on them. And to the extent that you've done the work to say these are the 130, that's there. And, I mean, and so as we're going into our budgeting process, that's already there. I mean, we've heard you. And to the extent that you adopt a process that says, you know, here are the sub-goals, and here are the things that staff is working on, I mean, we have to work that into the budget process. And I can't think of an example right off the bat, but, I mean, all of the department directors know that these are the things that, you know, they want to be working on, or should be working on, and the council wants us to be working on. And so as they're looking, participatory budgeting, as an example, it was on that list. And it's not been approved per se in 130 things here, but if we get to J in the CIP, you're gonna see that there's money proposed in that CIP related to participatory budgeting. That's just one example, I guess, that I would put out there. Or the sustainability issues, or the housing. I mean, so the CIP has proposals in there related to affordable housing. And that's directed because of the conversations we've had and the way that came out as a priority in the work that we did in March with the work plan. So, that didn't answer the question?
My trust level is lukewarm on it, so
Okay.
I think, to be really transparent.
Yeah.
So, not about you, it's the process.
Mhm.
So, cause I think council has wanted to get the work plan aligned with the budget, and I think has an expectation that the budget then reflects the work plan. So if we move away from the work plan, then how do we assure that?
I don't think you're moving away from the work plan. That gets back to the communication piece, and, you know, the only nuance I think that I'm trying to emphasize is the communication tool has to be very transparent and very active and very ongoing. But the idea that the council approves a very specific 2-year, 130-item work plan, and it doesn't change for anybody unless it's amended, that's the part I'm trying to find a more flexible. I think we should have a more flexible mechanism for that. It doesn't mean that the items that are on here somehow disappear at all. I mean, they would be very actively there and report out, and would be adjusted as, in the context of the resources, as council wants to, add, sober server as an example. So, yeah, I think it has more to do with the process than it does actually not being, I'm not saying in any way we shouldn't be accountable for this work. We should be very accountable for this work. And it should be very transparent as to where we're at with these different projects. I'm just proposing that there should be a mechanism that when we're nimble and we're responding things, we're doing that in a context of what it means for the resources we have and the work we'd already planned to do if we're adding more work to it at some point, in between.
What if we end up voting on the process and not the plan itself?
So that's kind of what I'm proposing.
Yeah.
It is you're
So, yeah,
adopting a
this-
process, and the process will reference all of this, right? But it's there, and actually, at that point, the process goes forward with the work. And then to Laura's point, whether at some point, we probably want to have some intentional time with the overall work plan. So it's not always just being piecemeal, but there's some intentional time, and I think on an annual basis, because before that was being done every 3 years. And I think every year we could still have some time to say, well, let's just really digest this thing and see if it's, the way we've been modifying it all year and the way we're looking at it, does it need a reset? And if so, how much of a reset from a conversation perspective? Yeah.
When our city engineer presents street projects, he said, well, we're working on this street, and because we're in this geographic area of the city, we're gonna do this other one. It's more efficient this way.
Right.
Okay. I'm sure of those 130, there's some that fall within your bailiwick, and most of them fall within some department.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It would seem to me that this is your responsibility. We say, these are the deals, okay? These are what we think are important, the most important.
Go get them done.
Okay? And if there is one that isn't quite as high as another, but because of the way the budget is laid out or the organization is dealing with an issue, it makes more sense to do this other one, more efficient, spending our resources more efficiently. You tell us, all right, I had to do this, and it's gonna save us this, or this is the reason, and we say, hold on, time out. That really is too important. And we can't move that one. We gotta get that done. Okay. Is that too cumbersome?
No, I think that's kind of what I'm talking about, is that when there are new things that we want to do, there's a conversation and a mechanism to talk about the impact of doing that.
Yeah.
That's really, in a nutshell, what I'm asking to try to develop and bring back to you.
Dale, I wonder if this, I think you're right, Dave. I wonder if there's a way to have a kind of tracking mechanism similar to what we do already in our weekly reports, but for this.
Yes.
And then if they're, at the end of a meeting, if there are like substantial change that someone wants to bring up or talk about, at the end of our city council meeting, we could say, I noticed a substantial change on this, I wanna actually reference that, or speak to it or something, at the end of our council meetings if there's big changes. gives us a checkpoint.
Well, I would suggest that if you are making the big changes, the impact has been discussed before you made the big change, and so when you make the big change, you know what the impact
I just mean
is.
it could be an opportunity for a time of communication, where, you know, you often give those updates, here's what's going on. You could also say, I wanna reference this because this has changed and I just wanna draw your attention to it. If it's included, I just feel like it's at the end of our meeting, potentially could be a good time to have a discussion about it. Cause we used to do directives where we'd say, city manager, I want you to do a parking plan for the next, you know, parking study or whatever. We used to do that, we don't do directives anymore. But I wonder if that space could actually be filled up with some conversation around this mechanism.
I guess what I'd be proposing is that it's there's the communication of what the changes were, and not, you know, every 2 weeks we're talking about, you know, the changes to it, but you're getting those updates, you're getting that feedback, and then there's a very, just like we did in March, there's a very intentional time that's spent on the work plan,
Mhm.
so that it doesn't become too piecemeal with time.
Are we starting to settle into the real discussion once a year? Is that what people are hearing?
That's, you know, essentially what I was proposing, when we gotta step back to when we started all this, used to be a conversation that happened once every 3 years.
Yeah.
And I was proposing we have the conversation once a year. There's been some, I think, healthy conversation about should that happen, you know, with, you know, brand new, newly elected, you know, people who really don't have as much experience, or do you do it with before? And I'm open to that, and I think kind of settling on the idea that conversation might happen in early May, you know, so that the new council members have an opportunity to weigh in on that. But it's really, once a year, let's just have a really nice touch point that's solely focused on, you know, on the work plan. And then throughout the year, to the extent that their staff is bringing things forward, or council's bringing things forward, there's an informed perspective of what the impact of those things are to the work plan. That, I guess, is the concept.
And if staff proposes changes, would we also know changes, the impact on the work plan?
Yep.
I would say the Board of Health does, in our packet every month, have the next grid of the goals
And what they're working on and what the status is. Yeah, so
it's just
we've
part of
talked
the-
about different, you know, what it looks like in terms of, you know, there's different tools that you can use, like Laura was referencing, that say, here's the status of it, it's 50% done, 70% done, when's the expected completion time? You know, did that change? You know, and then, you know, you can always call me or ask me and say, well, why did that get done? I don't think you'll call and say, why did that get done soon? But you say, why did that get delayed?
Okay, so I'm just trying to picture this, because I think part of the challenge of this is a lot of abstraction. And so let's say we decide not to, you know, vote on a plan, vote on a sort of more flexible communication protocol. And we're doing that, and then, you know, constituents contact, you know, me, and I want to bring something forward. What is the process then for deciding whether that, you know, whether to bring a resolution forward? What does that process look like in terms of, do we all need to be aware in advance of what types of things would be reshuffled around prior to bringing that up? Or I'm just trying to figure out how this would work.
So we have that pre-legislative work. I mean, we have a process that, again, we can talk about that process too, and I think Julia alluded to that process might benefit from, you know, a review or an update. But it is what it is now. And essentially, so say you came to me and you said, you know, I'd really like to develop this, right? And you're working with us on that, and we're working with you on it. Part of that development process would be, just know that, you know, that's gonna, if we're gonna go forward with this, it's going to change this in terms of the work plan. And when it came to council, that's part of the analysis, essentially, of if we do this, here's the impact it's gonna have. So it's just an informed decision, Whereas, say, again, I'll go back to last summer where there were 20 new items, but those items came forward and they were all great ideas, but they just weren't in the context of what's the impact of those. And all this would do is put a new idea in the context of what it impacts on other things, so that that could be part of the conversation.
Okay, so I'm just thinking, so part of the communication strategy would be some kind of update combined with probably more sort of pre-legislative meetings. That's sort of what we're picturing. Okay.
Now, just tailing on what she is asking, are you imagining this being a large group or just to the person that has the question? I could imagine, I can't imagine that kind of pre-legislative conversation in the council meeting, especially if it's, well, period. I'm kind of thinking that for every good idea that you have, maybe that person would, with their constituents, decide whether or not, based on what would be moved around, do they want to bring it further into conversation or not. So is everything going to be a large group conversation?
That's how
No.
that's how the pre-legislative session is set up, is to bring it on a Monday night to the entire council.
But that's only if the manager has said the
Yeah.
resources aren't there for it, period.
Oh.
Which, again, Ms. Novak said, and pointed out incorrectly, that's a process that pits the manager against the council. I mean, just in the structure of the way that's set up. And it's probably worth talking about and revisiting a little bit. So, at least in the current process, if the manager said, you know what, those resources just aren't there, it would go through the pre-legislative works, process. And the impact of that would be very much part of that entire group thing. If the manager says, I think we can work that, and we can do that, but there'd probably still be that conversation, but, just know that that's gonna bump this out or that out. Then that would get reported out. I mean, that would, in the reports that are come out, they would show that, well, this got moved out because we brought this in or something like that.
I'm really interested in being fluid. I'm feeling kind of resistant in this particular moment. A resistant person wanting to be fluid. So, there you go. I also have, like in the pre-legislative meetings, all that information that requires you to react and vote. That's also not my natural style. I'd rather, digest it and vote on it later. So, I like the idea. I'm feeling a little challenged.
Me too.
Yeah.
I wonder if there could be, if new legislation comes forward, if there could be options, kind of how we have on a cover sheet, if you could identify different options for what could get bumped, so that we could have that conversation as that item comes up on our agenda. And maybe we say, I'm okay with us doing this. Emily's bringing forward south side parking permitting. No one wants that thing. And then, but there's different options, and council can say, I like us bumping this option versus that option. Because not everything is gonna come through a work plan, especially if it's something smaller. Or it's not gonna go through a work session, pre-leg session.
So how do you guys wanna go forward? I mean, we've reached our hour and a half, and I just wanted to raise the issue that the next step would be to take 130 items and have you guys approve it, and that's all we do until council approves it. And I just wanted to have the conversation to say, is that really what we want to do?
Well, the other idea is to shave off 20% of them and give ourselves some wiggle room to bring in about 20% as the year progresses.
Or just put the 36 council things in there and you keep working on the administrative side of, whatever the 100 things are.
But a lot of those 100 things are things that we've identified that we thought you guys wanted from a council perspective. Or they are work that, has already been queued up by some, good examples, the transit center, right? I mean, there's been decisions made to build a new transit center, and there's a lot of work that goes into that. And that's, been an identified priority and something that we have to put a lot of work into to follow through and finish.
Yes, it's kind of hard because what's being proposed is something we can't see
Yep.
visually, so we're talking about it. So maybe seeing something could be helpful.
Oh, absolutely.
In
So-
providing feedback to you. I think for me, probably if I really boil it down, is I am wired to try new things, like, it's okay if it's warty and hairy and, you know, we can have lessons learned, that's totally fine. And I also don't wanna be burned that if I propose something, then it's defunding the football team, the community football team. Like, how do we move from, like, sometimes feeling that way to, like, we're for each other, we're for this, not for each other, that's good, we're for the community, and so the defunding the community football team, totally in air quotes, that is not even a thing, it's like, we are all pulling towards the same way. And that's where I feel like having the work plan so solidified, it's like, that's nice, cause I feel like, okay, we all know what we're getting ourselves into. And then I like the idea of being really flexible and trying something new, I wanna do that. I don't wanna be, I've gotta be able to be effective for the community that I feel like I represent and not have it, like, the world's gonna collapse if a new idea comes forth.
The challenge, of course, is that we have limited resources, and everything we do has a constituency and has people who are advocates for it. And adding something new when the resources are limited, or in some cases, it does mean having those hard conversations. And we're not gonna be able to always just say, well, we can add more to this and there's not an impact, and there's not a cost to it, there's not a change. So what happens is if we add new things and we don't have that conversation and we don't prioritize it, there's stuff that goes off the back end that probably people don't want to have happen, but they didn't know it got pushed off the back end. And that's not good public policy or public responsibility either.
What does council think if Dale works up a very high-level draft, not spending tons of time on it, sends it to council, and it doesn't sound like anybody's saying no, it also doesn't sound like anybody's falling over of like, this is awesome. Well, maybe one person, maybe two people who said that, this sounds good, go for it. And it seems that we either need to give you a directive, yes, go for it, or work up a high-level draft. And
Nope,
we'll have
I'm
to
not
come-
asking for a draft. All I was asking for is, are we open to something that has more flexibility and more nimbleness than saying, here's 130 things, and it doesn't change unless there's council action, and giving me some thoughts and ideas of what your concerns are, and I absolutely would have to come back with something for you to have to react to and give conversation to.
Like for final legislation?
Absolutely.
Or a conversation?
No, conversation, I think it'd be another work session to say, okay, is this close? Is this,
Sounds good to me, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Then I will try to find something that is a process that in how we manage this work plan going forward, that you guys can react to in a work session format.
Thank you.
Okay, our hour and a half is up. We haven't touched the work plan, or the CIP yet.
There's pizza in the hallway.
And there's pizza in the hallway.
But more importantly, there's CIPs with Christine.
Ooh.
Hard copies.
Right.
CI pizza.
I'm really sensitive to the fact that we have not been able to hold to an hour, we try to keep the work session to an hour and a half to respect people's time in their evening. And this balance of the work we do together, and people have, personal lives that they're trying to manage as well. So, what's your pleasure? I said we were gonna try to keep it to an hour and a half, we're now 10 minutes after. We do have a work session scheduled next week on Tuesday. If we wanted, Jay, if you wanted to do a really quick, high-level overview, how long would that take?
15 minutes.
Okay. you wanna do that? Do you wanna have at least a high level?
Yeah, it'd be good to.
Because it would start to put in context, what, you know, what you're getting, what's being handed out to you.
And,
But we just need a pizza break.
and can you, if it's okay with you, totally your call of dismissing staff to say you're free to go. And again, totally up to you, you know, since we're running past that, to honor their time too.
Well, except that they haven't seen it either. They haven't seen the overview. I mean, they have a copy of it as well, but they haven't seen the presentation or overview, so. All right, let's be really quick about grabbing some pizza and coming back in, and we'll take 15 minutes, but like 5 minutes, and let's hold to that. Just run out. Okay, that's 5 minutes. Let's get rolling. Jay, 15 minutes, high overview, the CIP that's being presented to the council. Here we go.
So real quick, as we talked about last time, projects in the CIP are those that are used to buy, maintain, or improve fixed assets such as buildings, vehicles, equipment, or land. Costs must exceed $5,000, and costs are usually one-time in nature. So I'm gonna flip over to our OpenGov site. Now, this is a site that all of you have access to, and you can go and explore the CIP to your heart's content, just like I'm about to do, if this will maximize. There we go. So I created some CIP views here for folks as part of this presentation. So the first view here is showing the CIP broken down by the different funds. So as you can see, there's a little slider here in 2020, the projects in the 2020 CIP. It's predominantly about 28% are the library improvements. This is the first time I've ever seen this. Dave is being outdone. Only 20% of the projects are transportation improvements. And you can see the various other categories of projects that are included for 2020. Water makes up a good share of it, as does land building and equipment. And also below, if you go below, you can see what all of the individual projects are that are included.
Wow.
So then if I move this slider over to 2021, now you can see that Dave is back up to 34% of the CIP funding for 2021. And you can go through each one of these. Water is now at about 22, land building and equipment is about 13–14%. So you can see the distribution of all the projects. As I move that slider over, these are now the 2022 projects, and broken out by, and Dave's now up to 43%, so he just.
Brenda's my friend.
So you can take a look at all of these projects by year, and see the distribution by the different funds. Also, if I click on this next view, CIP by fund all years, this is actually for the entire CIP, so all 5 years of this CIP, and the projects by different funds. Also broken out the CIP by funding sources. So this is where we get into whether we're issuing bonds or promissory notes, or whether it's coming from general fund balance, or how we're paying for each of these different items. And just like that other one, we can drag this slider across. So in 2020, you can see that the general fund balance is making up, we're using about $2.6 million of general fund balance to fund the CIP. We're going to be issuing about $15 million in general obligation bonds that are being supported by the property tax levy. We're issuing about $15.7 million in general obligation bonds that are self-supported. They're being paid for by something other than property tax revenue, like water utility, wastewater utility, one of those non-property tax supported revenues. And just like before, I can drag this across, and you see the pie chart keeps changing. Whoops, as I drag it across and make it crash.
It was surprised at what the transportation budget was.
Yeah,
See, Dave broke it.
I don't blame it.
He can probably fix it though, too.
Yeah, that's what I'm concerned about, Dave fixing it. Yeah. So I'm just running through these very quickly. We also talked about different project categories. So we talked about new, things that are new, things that we're maintaining or replacing, and then some things fall into both. And this is 2020. This is the library. So we're doing an expansion and we're doing a maintenance to the existing library. So it really falls into both categories. But one of the things that cities often get criticized for is that, oh, they want to build new shiny things all the time, and we're not taking care of what we have. We're very proud, actually, that a great deal of our resources typically go to maintaining and taking care of what we have. And I know it's not real exciting, it's not real sexy, if you will, but it's necessary. We need to take care of our streets, we need to take care of our buildings, we need to take care of all of our facilities out there so that people can continue to enjoy them. So again, if I drag the slider across, you'll see that the maintenance and replace items generally are somewhere in the 70 to towards 90% range. If we look at all years of the CIP, over the entire CIP, about 72% of the funds are going to maintain or replace items. About 18-19% are going for new investments, and about 8%, 9% are for projects that would fall into both categories. So I also broke it down by our strategic goals. So we've been talking about our strategic goals a lot today, this evening. So I broke down our projects by our strategic goals. And so for 2020, about 57% of the projects are going for safe, functional, accessible infrastructure. About 28% are going towards personal learning, growth and development. That's the library project. About 3% is optimizing the organizational potential, and you can see the other about 7, almost 8% for economic prosperity for all. And once again, we can drag the slider across and see how that changes over the course of the CIP, in which categories those projects are fitting into. So this kind of gives you a high level view of how what funds are funding the projects, what sources of funding are we using to pay for these projects, whether these projects are new or whether they're maintaining or replacing an existing asset, and what strategic goal are the projects going towards. And once again, underneath you can see the different projects that are included within that year, and within, if I actually click on one of these strategic goals, like safe functional infrastructure, the view down below will change so that now it's showing which projects are within that safe functional infrastructure category. So wanted to show that to you. This is available to you from our website. It's under that financial transparency link, and you don't need a password or anything, and just a kind of a different way to look at the CIP and give you that high level overview. One other thing I went through and did was at our last work session talking about the CIP, we did a prioritization exercise, and so we started out talking about what was included in the prior CIP for 2019 and 2020. We put those into different categories. Then we each council member had the opportunity to put $25 and distribute that amongst these different buckets. So this is how, based upon that distribution, this is how much council would fund each of these items. And we said that this is, this isn't meant to be necessarily an allocation or a funding decision, but really to express the general priorities and sentiment of the council. So then I went through and I took all the projects from the 2020 through 2024, the recommended CIP, and did the same thing with them. So, started out from where we were in the last CIP and, council's ranking, and expression of preferences, and then the recommended CIP that's before you. So you can see that, generally, the safe, functional, accessible infrastructure declines slightly. Environmentally sensitive and sustainable services, specifically renewable energy, increases slightly. I think I increased funding for renewable energy in this CIP by about $900,000 over the five years of the CIP. Optimizing organizational potential, that actually ended up increasing just slightly. Safe, healthy, connected neighborhoods actually ended up increasing fairly significantly. Most of that is being driven by the railroad safety improvements, and specifically the overpass or underpass, whichever it is, of Jackson, not Jackson Street, of Galloway. That's primarily what's driving that increase. Livable, lovable, fun. You can see that was here in the last CIP. Council added a little bit lower. Actually, in this CIP, it's even a little bit lower than that. Inclusive housing, affordable housing development. We did include funding in this CIP for in 2022, 23, and 24 for affordable housing development. And then lastly, engaged community. There is funding again in the CIP for participatory budgeting. I believe it's budgeted at $100,000 a year for that. So just thought it would be interesting to go through the work we did last time, kind of compare that now to where we're at in the recommended CIP. So this CIP uses about $2.88 million in fund balance in 2020 to fund the projects in here. Requires about $7.6 million in new borrowing for 2020. That does not include the library renovation expansion. Increases debt service by about $415,000, or increase of about 4.7% in 2021. Cost the owner of a $174,000 house about $13.68 per year. And the 2023 through 2025 debt service increases at an average rate of about $967,000 per year. So you can see that if $415,000 results in $13.68, $967,000 per year is going to basically double that amount. The unassigned fund balance, the council's policy is that it is greater than or equal to 15% of the next year's general fund expenditures, with a goal of 20%. As you can see, we do fall within the green box here, which is compliance with our fund balance policy. I believe when I brought this to you at the last work session, I was estimating at that time, 2023, 2024, we'd be down to about 17%. A little bit higher than that is where it ended up coming in at, between 18 and 19% is where our fund balance ends up with this recommended CIP. We also have a council policy that the levy for debt service shall not exceed 25% of the total property tax levy. So the blue line here again is the historical levy-supported debt service. The green line here represents 25% of the total tax levy. And then the red line, which is an extension of the blue, represents proposed debt service with the CIP. So you can see our debt service is continuing to grow, but we're still keeping a margin between the proposed debt service and our maximum debt service under council policy for unforeseen circumstances or things that may come up that we need to be able to react to. And then lastly, again, the library project requires approximately $8.5 billion in new borrowing in 2020. It will increase the debt service by about $585,000 in 2021, and will cost the owner of a $174,000 house about $19 per year. So if you couple that $19 per year with the $13.68 per year, you're about $23 per year that the 2020 projects will increase the property tax levy for owners of that $174,000 house. So that's a high-level overview. I think I did it in pretty close to 15 minutes.
You did 14 minutes.
14,
Well
there we go.
Good job.
But
There you go.
by all means, we put the information out on OpenGov for you to be able to use it and play with it and look at the data in different ways. And we'll go into specific projects at the next work session.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was wondering, following just the JFC hearings, state level, and it sounds like we'll be getting maybe an increase in funding for streets, and would that affect these numbers at all? Or maybe that's a big question.
Yeah, no, the answer is no. The answer is, I guess it could. It could reduce the amount of borrowing that we need to do.
Okay.
Now, the streets money comes into is general fund revenue, and generally gets used for, the street aid money generally gets used for our street rehabilitation programs, which we don't borrow. We don't borrow for the chip and seal program, those sorts of things. So generally, those road aids are coming into our general fund budget
For
to pay for
maintenance.
those maintenance expenses.
But to the extent that it does come in for construction projects, our recommendation would be to use that to just borrow less.
Borrow less.
Right.
Okay, it's helpful to know.
Which translates into less of a tax rate increase.
You may have told us already, but how much of the 2018 budget did we not spend and went back into fund balance, or have we calculated that?
On the operating budget, it was over, remember Christine? I'm thinking is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $2.5 million, $2.5 to $3 million.
Which is typical.
So I think where you may be going with that, Dave, is that, we're still in a place where, in fact, we can, see it on this, where, in 20, our fund balance from 2017 to 2018 really didn't decline. So even though, again, when we adopt the CIP, we plan to use $2.5–3 million of fund balance. Generally, we haven't actually had to draw it down by that amount.
I was wondering how close it was to the 2.88.
Yeah. So we, as you can see, it's and these are all based upon projections, but you see it's bouncing around here, and then in the last few years is where we really start drawing it down, because we are planning to use, again, under this CIP, some pretty significant amounts of fund balance in the latter years, so we don't have to borrow.
And then how long, it seems like last year when you showed this graph, how long does that, there's a point at which we start moving back up again on the fund balance, do we know?
Not necessarily, it all depends, these are all based upon projections of what we're gonna spend. I think that, my goal is to maintain it probably about where this level is, 18%. Our goal is, 20, 15 to 20, anything over 15 we can use for capital projects. So as long as we keep it within that policy, it doesn't hurt us, it shouldn't hurt us as far as the bond rating agencies go. If we start dropping down, down below that 15%, then we're gonna get nicked for that.
Any other questions?
Any question, I think it's the fourth slide, it's the, where you compare the council's input.
Yep.
So the first column that has numbers is it's just a 1-year snapshot. But then like for last year's CIP.
For last year's CIP, the prior CIP, prior to this CIP.
So it was just 1 year?
It was 19 and 20. It was an average of 19 and 20.
First year,
Also,
it's the first year of the CIP, apples to apples.
Right.
Okay, but then but then you're comparing it to a 5-year period averaged out?
Yes.
So like, it's the average of one of the 5 years?
Well, it's.
Or of the 5?
Yeah, I mean, it's an average of all 5 years of
Okay.
this, of the recommended CIP.
Okay. So,
Good question, though.
yeah, just because, I mean, I see certain things like the parking facilities going up, like doubled, and what was
Whoops, sorry.
happening before, and that's because we're actually gonna be potentially building a new ramp.
Well,
And we didn't do that last time.
Right, exactly, and there's about $3 million in the general fund for design and engineering for new parking structures. There's actually no construction of the new parking structures included in here because the parking structure that's included is proposed to be funded out of the TIF. So there's $10 million in 2024 to be funded out of TID number 11. There's actually $15 million that was pushed back, that I couldn't include in this CIP, that I pushed out to 2025. So it isn't even on here because we don't have the capacity for it right now.
I got a birthday coming up in a couple days.
You asked for money for the parking ramp.
No, should we, what's gonna happen first, the end of this meeting or my celebration?
Depends on where your celebration is.
Anything else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this the budget that's being.
This is the recommended
Can we
CIP.
change anything or request anything be changed at this juncture?
So this is the recommended CIP from the city manager to the council. We will have some work sessions where we help inform you as to what's actually in there. Then you will be asked to adopt it, and when you adopt it, you can make whatever changes you want to it.
Okay. I guess one of my concerns is I was hoping that the exercise that we were doing was gonna inform this document more, but it doesn't seem to me that it did, that that there were already placeholders before we did that exercise. And can we get a feeling of like what our priorities, how our priorities informed this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I went through that a little bit, where the affordable housing piece,
Yeah.
if you look on page,
Well, like, the affordable housing is a good example. I see that as, it's pushed out into years 3, 4, and 5. But I think given the extent of what priority it is for the council right now, not future councils, that it would be higher reflection in next year's CIP.
right, and I think certainly if council wants to make changes, council, can make changes to the document. As a plan, we talked about that those new projects should be added in the out years of the CIP, because, this is a plan, and we've, put together a plan, and projects are moving forward based upon that plan. So it's more difficult to alter the early years of the CIP as opposed to the later years of the CIP, when you can actually plan for those projects to move forward, and to include funding for those projects, as opposed to, there may be a project in 2020 of this CIP that's been in there for 4 years, and all of a sudden, now we're gonna pull that project out because it's been waiting its turn, but now it's not gonna happen because.
But new projects do come in.
Not very many, not in
very
first
many.
year or two of the
Not in the
CIP.
next year. There's very few that are like a surprise, or, that weren't thought of a year or two before that are in there. One other comment or observation I would make is, we took very seriously there was some feedback as we talked about that exercise, you know, are we gonna be pinned exactly to it? And we said, no, this is to give us an indication. And several times we, you know, if we followed that literally, there'd be a 40% reduction in street projects. And what we thought we heard was, well, we're trying to give you an indication of where we would want things to go. We don't really want a 40% reduction in street projects. So we took this as and versus or. I mean, that's a very important that the direction was not, you know, it's either or. In other words, cut street projects by 40% and do these, but figure out where we can go and, right? I mean, a little bit, Catherine, back to your earlier comment. How do we make these priorities of the council work without having to, say, go after the football team, which is street projects, in a CIP context? So this was an attempt at listening to your feedback and your priorities and incorporating those in an and way, being sensitive to the idea that you know, when new projects come in, they usually are a year or two out. They're not, you know, right there. Now, in the amendment process or in your adoption process, if you want to say, you know what, we really do want to take something that had been planned for 2 or 3 years and bump it out with something that's, you know, brand new, that is certainly a prerogative, you know, as we go through the adoption process.
And, you know, I mean, this CIP does include $1.25 million for affordable housing.
It's,
Which, without really bumping anything, you know, without, like Dale said, without having to pit it against, you know, the home team, so to speak. I mean, so, you know, we tried to accommodate that within the context of the plan, as opposed to, you know, having to make those choices.
Jeremy?
I guess one thing that I like this, what you have up here, I think maybe in addition, a column, or maybe a whole other slide, that says what the 5-year average has been in the last 5 years of actual expenditures.
It's a ton of work.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess the thing is, it gives us a better comparison of a true shift between a 5-year period
Sure.
and the next 5-year period, because, I mean, some of them are so small and variable.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even some of the large accounts are very variable, like with Dave's account.
And that's something that, you know, if that's a tracking that you want to use, you know, it becomes less work if we know about that and we're tracking, you know, we're organizing the data in a way to be able to track that going forward.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, because
Anything else? Yes, Catherine?
I guess, I think it's gonna be really helpful for the manager to help give council some options of how we can navigate with you on this, with the organization on this. You know, the exercise was given to council, the dollar amount exercise, again, not that council didn't ask for the exercise.
Right.
And council clearly said this is not dollar per dollar signal that we're giving.
Right.
Is that directives were already given to department heads before council even came out with, directives of getting, proposals to the manager and the finance director on the CIP. You know, you already had received CIP requests before we even did this exercise. So I think, to me, it's a little bit of a challenge on that sequencing, because
or the work plan.
so, I guess I don't wanna get into a tangle in July about this. I want to work together as a team. And so I think it would be very helpful for council to hear some options. I mean, if truly it is at the amendment floor, then that's an option. However, I think it's better for us to work together up front if there are some opportunities to say, you know, I think you might wanna realign something here. For instance, affordable housing, for me to go out now to constituents to say, in 3 years, we'll be able to address it in the CIP. That's difficult.
So this is my recommendation based upon what we heard, you know, from council. in a planning process, right, in a 5-year planning process. So I guess, you know, I'm at a little bit of a loss as to what, I mean, how to address that concern. I mean, to the extent that you want to make changes to it, we can certainly help you understand the impact of changes that you might want to make, and help you, you know, set those priorities. But at the end of the day, by statute, I'm obligated to say, this is my best recommendation, and you're obligated to either like it or not like it, or amend it or change it any way you want. And I can help you with those amendments, and I say I as we, you know, in terms of, if you wanted to have affordable housing, you know, more affordable housing, and you wanted it to be sooner, what are some options to change? You know, this was our best attempt at finding a balance that is addressing what we heard was important to you, from our perspective, without going after the football team, to use your earlier, you know, analysis. You know, in terms of cutting it out, and so, you know, to the extent that we want to do it differently, or you want to do it differently, and we can talk about that. But this is simply our recommendation, or my recommendation, and you know, that's what those work sessions will be for, is to have you work through how you may want to change that recommendation. You know, we worked to listen to the feedback that the council had, and again, look at this in terms of and, without having the or conversations.
So. I wonder if it had, after that exercise, if it had been brought back to council and said, is this going far enough in matching council's priorities? You know, I mean, affordable housing is a perfect one. It's hard for me to go out and say, we're gonna do this in 3 years' time. And the amendment process is, and we just saw what it looked like last year. It's just, I'd hope there would be more ability for us to align with this before it gets published. But I guess we're down to the same exact thing. I mean, we have people in the community who are proposing things like you shouldn't be able to make any budget amendments during the campaigns. You shouldn't be able to make budget amendments over a certain dollar amount. You shouldn't be able to do X, Y. I mean, it got so incredibly out of hand trying to make budget amendments.
Even when we brought it forth like 3-4 weeks ahead of time to try to work collaboratively, it still puts the council in a very difficult spot.
I guess one question I have that is related to that, it seems like the CIP, like the published, recommended CIP came out a little bit later last year than this year. And in some ways, it's good that it's early because we have more time, and you know and it's better to get a CIP approved and through council in the summer versus in the fall. At the same time, you run into some of these issues that Andrew and Catherine raised, where it's like, oh my gosh, this is the recommended document right in front of us now, and now we have to start talking about amendments instead of talking about the big picture a little bit. I know you said you've done some discussion of the bigger picture, but that's the tough balance, is like it's great that this is out early in many ways, you know, but maybe it has some drawbacks too, so.
Okay. All right, well, next week, Tuesday, we'll be diving into it and talking more about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night. Happy birthday, Dave.
This program was brought to you by a cooperation between Newsworks and the City of Eau Claire. A transcript of this meeting is available for the hearing impaired. It will be available within 7 days of this telecast. Call 715-839-4912 or TDD 715-839-1689. Or write Eau Claire City Clerk, P.O. Box 5148, Eau Claire, Wisconsin 54702-5148. Newsworks is made possible by continuing community support. If you would like to volunteer or make a donation, please contact us via phone at 715-839-5067 or online at valleymediaworks.org.